Assalamu alaikum. I'm Professor Dr. Hayder Mubarak. This is a presentation to practical aspects of the diencephalon. The diencephalon is formed of 5 parts, which are the thalamus, the first part, and below the thalamus is the hypothalamus and subthalamus, while above the thalamus is the epithalamus, which is formed of pineal gland, habenular trigone or nuclei, and posterior commissure, in addition to the medial and lateral geniculate bodies, which are called metathalamus. Some authors consider the metathalamus, the medial and lateral geniculate bodies, are parts of the thalamus, and so they consider that the diencephalon is formed of 4 parts, not 5 parts. The cavity of the diencephalon is the third ventricle. Considering details of these 4 parts of the diencephalon, I will start with the thalamus. As this figure shows, a coronal section in the cerebrum at the level of the body of lateral ventricle, which is the central part of the lateral ventricle. You can see the right and left lateral ventricles, the roof of them, which is the body of lateral ventricles of the brain. The roof of them is corpus callosum, and the medial wall of them is formed by the septum pellucidum that extends from the corpus callosum to the fornix, while the floor is formed laterally by the caudate nucleus, medially by the thalamus. You can see that between the fornix and the thalamus is the choroid fissure that allows passage of a fold of Paya, which is called tila choroidi, containing choroid plexus, deep to this choroid fissure between the fornix and thalamus, into the right and left lateral ventricles. This tila choroidi and choroid plexus also seen in the roof of this cavity, which is the third ventricle in between the right and left thalami. So, starting with the thalamus is defined as egg-like gray matter in the center of the cerebral hemisphere. It is bounded or limited anteriorly by the interventricular foramen of Monro, while it is limited posteriorly by the posterior commissure, which is the inferior lamina of the stalk of pineal gland. Below the thalamus is the hypothalamus and subthalamus, and posteriorly below the thalamus is the midbrain. Medially, the right and left thalami are related to the cavity of the third ventricle, as it is shown in this figure. While laterally, the right and left thalami are bounded by the internal capsule, and I think from the presentation of the medullary centers, you know the internal capsule is the projection fibers of the medullary centers. Above is formed corona radiata, and it is in continuity with the cortex of cerebrum. So, laterally, the thalamus is related to the internal capsule, which is a projection fiber between lentiform nucleus laterally and caudate and thalamus medially. Dorsally, some authors suggest that this region, dorsal to the thalamus, which is below the splenium of corpus callosum, or we can say this is the region between occipital lobe of cerebrum and cerebellum. Here is what's called the transverse cerebral fissure. This fissure is considered as a dorsal relation to the thalamus. The function of the thalamus is that it is a relay station for all type of sensation except olfactory sensation that is connected with the limbic lobe. In addition to that, it regulates consciousness by its connection with the reticular formation of the brain stem. You know, when you have any kind of sensation and you are asleep, the reticular formation is regulating the sleep, and sensation relayed in the thalamus will stimulate the reticular formation to awake you because of this sensation received by the thalamus. The egg-like thalamus has anterior end and posterior end, and they are called also anterior pole and posterior pole. The posterior pole of the thalamus is called the palvinar. This is the palvinar of the thalamus. It lies above the superior colliculus of midbrain. We said that inferiorly the relation of the thalamus is to the midbrain, and you can see here the back of the brainstem, and you can see the superior colliculi, and superior lateral to them is the palvinar, which is the posterior pole of the thalamus. And also this figure shows that the thalamus has 4 surfaces. The upper surface related to the cavity of the lateral ventricle, while the medial surface is related to the third ventricle. The lateral surface is related to the internal capsule, and the inferior surface is related to the, as I said, thalamus, hypothalamus, and to the hypothalamus, subthalamus, and to the midbrain from anterior to posterior. So now we will discuss relations of the surfaces of the thalamus. As I said, the superior surface is related to the cavity of the lateral ventricle, but it is laterally related to the caudate nucleus, and in between the caudate nucleus and the thalamus is the thalamostriated vein, which is shown here, and the stria terminalis. Also, the thalamus superior surface is separated from the cavity of the lateral ventricle on its medial part by the fold of tila choroidi containing choroid plexus. The medial surface is related to the cavity of the third ventricle, as we said. And the junction of the superior surface and medial surface, which is this one, near the choroid fissure, contain a lamina of white fiber, which is called stria medullaris thalami. This is not the stria terminalis between the thalamus and the caudate. This is caudate, this is thalamus, this is stria terminalis, which is with the thalamostriated vein. This is stria medullaris thalami, between the medial surface of the thalamus and superior surface of the thalamus. So the medial surface of the thalamus is covered by a ependymal lining of the third ventricle, and here we may see a gray matter connection between the right and left thalami, but this connection is not a functional connection, it is only an anatomical connection, and it is seen actually in this figure. This is the circular region here. This is an interthalamic connection, which is connecting the right and left thalami, but it is not a functional connection. It is only an anatomical connection of a gray matter. The medial surface, therefore, is limited above from the superior surface by the stria medullaris thalami. Inferiorly, the medial surface is limited by the hypothalamic sulcus, separating it from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamic sulcus extends from the interventricular foramen to the aqueduct of Salidius. The lateral surface of the thalamus, as we said, is the internal capsule, is related to the internal capsule. And if we take a transverse section, not coronal section, transverse section in the cerebrum, we can see that the internal capsule is V-shaped. It is formed of an anterior limb, posterior limb connected by genio. The anterior limb is between the caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus, while the posterior limb is between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus. Therefore, specifically, we can say that the lateral surface of the thalamus is related to the posterior limb of internal capsule. The inferior surface, we said before a while, inferior to the thalamus from anterior to posterior are the hypothalamus, subthalamus, and midbrain. And so these are two figures. One of them represented by the dotted yellow line, and the other is represented by the green dotted line. At the green dotted line, which is this figure, the coronal section shows that below the thalamus is the subthalamus and hypothalamus. The subthalamus, this is the gray matter of subthalamus. It appears just like a biconvex lens, and this is the gray matter of the hypothalamus. So the subthalamus and hypothalamus are below the anterior part of the thalamus, while posteriorly below the thalamus, this is a coronal section in the posterior part of the thalamus, and you can see that below the thalamus, this is the section showing the midbrain. This is the midbrain. The egg-like thalamus, having an internal structure formed of many or masses of gray matter. These masses are divided by Y-shaped lamina of white matter. This Y-shaped lamina is called internal medullary lamina. And the egg-like gray matter of the thalamus, therefore, is divided by this Y-shaped internal medullary lamina into groups of nuclei, which are anterior group, medial group, and lateral group. And just lateral to the lateral group is another lamina of white matter, which is called external medullary lamina, that is also covered laterally by a mass of gray matter called reticular nucleus of the thalamus. Each of these three groups, the anterior group, medial group, and lateral group of thalamic nuclei divided by the Y-shaped internal medullary lamina, shows subdivisions of a nuclei. The medial group is only a nucleus, which is called medial nucleus of thalamus. But the lateral group show all these nuclei that are listed there. The anterior group is also a nucleus by itself. And you can see that the medial and lateral geniculate bodies sometimes are considered as part of the thalamus, while other authors suggest that the medial and lateral geniculate bodies are related to the part of the diencephalon called metathalamus. They are considering the medial and lateral geniculate body as a fifth part of the diencephalon called metathalamus. Others consider the medial and lateral geniculate body as part of thalamus. You can see here on the medial side, this is the interthalamic connection, the gray matter connection of the right and left side thalami. It is here called intrathalamic adhesion, also called paraventricular nucleus, or called mass intermedia, or interthalamic connexus, or periventricular. All of these are synonyms, periventricular nucleus. It is a gray matter connection of the right and left thalami. We had demonstrated that in this figure. This is it, a gray matter connection between the right and left thalami. And we said it is only an anatomical connection. It is not a functional connection of anatomical gray matter connection. Some authors suggested also that different regions of the cerebral cortex, which has each of them has specific functions, are connected with a certain nucleus in the thalamus, and I think this figure represents that with names. Actually, this topic, the representation or the connections of the nuclei, specifically of the thalamus, each of them with a specific region of the cerebellum, is a matter of interest to many, but you have to depend on your requirements in the theory. You have to look about your this topic with your lecturer, if it is required from you in the exam or not. Even so, we have many different physiological and functional descriptions done in the theory by these topics and that topic, and I don't want to pass into these because I'm talking about practical session into the diencephalon. So please consider that with your lecturer if it is required from you, these details required from you in the exam or not. And these are many topics that are theoretical topics related to the theory and they are related to the function and connection of the thalamus considered in the theory. Before passing to other parts of the diencephalon, as the hypothalamus, subthalamus, and else, I want to revise the visual pathway, auditory pathway, and olfactory pathway. We said that all sensations relay into the thalamus except the olfactory pathway, the smell. The smell is not a sensation that has a relay into the thalamus. All other sensations relay into the thalamus. So apart from these, I want to discuss here the visual pathway as visual sensation relaying to the thalamus and auditory pathway. Of course, the visual pathway had been described previously. We have optic nerves and optic chiasma. At the optic chiasma, the medial fibers of the retina cross to the opposite side, and thus we will form optic tract. Till the optic tract, this optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract is formed by axons of cells in the retina called ganglionic cells. So ganglionic cells of the retina has an axon from optic nerve, optic chiasma, and optic tract. This axon of the ganglionic cells of the retina relay or connected with the neurons in the lateral geniculate body, which is the metathalamus. And the axons of the neurons in the lateral geniculate body form the optic radiation that forms the retrolentiform part of internal capsule to reach the primary visual area and the occipital lobe. You can see that the lateral geniculate body is connected with the superior colliculus by superior brachium. But this connection of the lateral geniculate body with the superior colliculus by the superior brachium is not part of the visual pathway. Actually, the superior colliculum regulates conjugate movements of the eye to the opposite side in response to visual stimuli. So its function of the superior colliculus is related to vision, but it is not related to the visual pathway. The superior colliculus and superior brachium connection with the lateral geniculate body regulates conjugate movements of the eyes to the opposite side in response to visual stimuli. While this figure shows you the auditory pathway. This is the inner ear, the semicircular canals, and the cochlea. And you can see that in the inner ear we have a ganglia, which is called cochlear ganglia. From it, the axons of it will pass to the vestibulocochlear nucleus, which is at the junction of the pons and medulla. The junction of pons and medulla contains posteriorly in the floor of the rhomboid fossa vestibulocochlear nucleus. So axons from the ganglia in the inner ear, the otic ganglia and the vestibular ganglia, pass to relay or connected with the vestibulocochlear nucleus and the junction of brain and in the junction of pons and medulla and the floor of the rhomboid fossa. Axons of the vestibulocochlear ganglia, nucleus, pass upward to be connected with the inferior colliculus, and axons of the neurons in the inferior colliculus pass through the inferior brachium, axons of the inferior colliculus, and neurons of the inferior colliculus pass into the inferior brachium to be connected with the medial geniculate body and connected with the neurons of medial geniculate body. Neurons or axons of the medial geniculate body form the auditory radiation, which is sublentiform part of internal capsule that reach to the auditory cortex in the floor of the stem of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, the auditory area, the Hagen's convolution. So here you can see that the inferior colliculus is directly related to the auditory pathway, but the superior colliculus is not related to the visual pathway. As I said, the olfactory pathway is not related to the thalamus. You can see that olfactory receptors are present in the roof of the nose, and here axons of the olfactory receptors pass through the cribriform plate of the anterior cranial fossa to be connected with the olfactory bulb. You know, the olfactory bulb had been seen in the inferior surface of the cerebrum. It lies in the sulcus for the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. So axons of the receptors from the roof of the nose pass through the cribriform plate and relay in neurons in the olfactory bulb at the inferior surface of the brain, lies on the sides of the cribriform plates on the sides of the crista galli. Axons of the olfactory bulb pass as olfactory tract, and the olfactory tract form right and left olfactory stria relating to structures mostly of the limbic system, because this system and other regions are concerned with olfaction. Now we will describe the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus lies below the thalamus and separated from it by the hypothalamic sulcus. Anteriorly, the hypothalamus is limited by the optic chiasma, and posteriorly, the hypothalamus is limited by the mammillary body. And I think you know what is the optic chiasma and what is the mammillary body from the description of the interpeduncular fossa. And above the hypothalamus is the thalamus, while below it is the midbrain. Again, this coronal section at the level of the body of the lateral ventricle, this is the thalamus, and below it is the subthalamus and hypothalamus. You can see that the hypothalamus laterally is also related to the internal capsule, just like the subthalamus and thalamus. All the thalamus, subthalamus, and hypothalamus are related laterally to the internal capsule. According to the theory, the gray matter of the hypothalamus is divided into 4 groups: pre-optic group, which is pre-optic nuclei; supra-optic group or suprachiasmatic group, which is this one; and the mammillary group of nuclei of the hypothalamus, and all others are under the name of tubercinarium group or tuberal region. And this is a subdivision to the nuclei of the hypothalamus according to the theory. Maybe there are more details to be considered according to the requirements of the theory in the exam. But this is the requirements that had been described in the theory. Again, just like the thalamus, there are many descriptions in the theory considering functional aspects of the hypothalamus and connections of the hypothalamus, and you have to discuss that with your lecturer if it is required from you in the theory or not. Here I want to ask something to you. The hypothalamus neurons secrete certain substances in certain regions. These certain substances secreted in the neurons of some of the hypothalamic nuclei pass through the axons of these neurons to the stalk of pituitary. And here they will be connected with the blood vessels in the stalk of the pituitary. And the blood vessels of the stalk of the pituitary will take these chemical substances from the axons of the neuron of the hypothalamus and convey them to the anterior pituitary. This way of transmissions of substances, mostly hormonal substances, from neurons in the hypothalamus via the axon of these neurons to blood vessels in the stalk of the pituitary, and then via the blood vessels of the stalk of the pituitary to the anterior pituitary is called hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal venous system. And you have to be aware of it now. Regarding the subthalamus, we said that this is the thalamus in section, and this is the hypothalamus. It is in form of biconvex lens below the thalamus. And you can see that this biconvex subthalamus is separated from the thalamus by white matter, and from the hypothalamus also by white matter. This is the hypothalamus. And this is a figure showing a shadow to the position of the subthalamus. You can see that the thalamus below is related to the hypothalamus, subthalamus, and midbrain. This is also a coronal section in the subthalamus, just like this section. You can see this orange colored subthalamus. The subthalamus here is obviously that it is connected with the globus pallidus, which is part of the lentiform nucleus, by reciprocal fibers, and I had represent the reciprocal connection by this double O configuration. So the subthalamus is connected with the globus pallidus, part of lentiform nucleus, by reciprocal connection, which is called subthalamic fasciculus. And this connection has an importance of connecting the diencephalon with the basal ganglia, and therefore it will relate the function of the diencephalon with motor regulation, which is a major function of the basal ganglia and will be considered with the basal ganglia. Another structure which is shown here is called zona incerta. Zona incerta is not something new to you. Before a while, we said that the lateral aspect of the thalamus shows a reticular nucleus, and I will show you that again. We said that the Y-shaped internal medullary lamina divides the gray matter of the thalamus into anterior group of nuclei, medial group of nuclei, and lateral group of nuclei. And lateral to the lateral group of nuclei, we have a white matter called external medullary lamina that is covered by a gray matter called reticular nucleus. This reticular nucleus is extending downward to the subthalamic region to form the zona incerta. So I will show you that this reticular formation forming zona incerta in this figure. You can see this is the thalamus, and this is the line representing the reticular nucleus, and you can see that the reticular nucleus extend down below the thalamus in the subthalamic region to form a mass which is called zona incerta. The epithalamus is formed by the posterior commissure, by the pineal gland, and a triangular region here called habenular trigone containing medial and lateral habenular nuclei, and it shares the function of the diencephalon and considered as one of the four parts of the diencephalon. That is most of the important practical aspects of the diencephalon. Thank you very much.